Ata uriata kanani cheri siwarani araparani hatiksi ka hisese hamashaka ini huriata kwahimbo. I purapecheska ka huchete tatecha arikwa hasinti ka Maria Kamanuele hi aringashinga sarata kuritanapu. Hello and thank you for coming to my talk. I'm Joseph Ursheta. I am the Executive Director of the Native Biodata Consortium. And the title of my talk is Dangerous Big Currents, Dangerous Big Data Currents, the Urgency of the Safe Harbor of Tribal Repositories. I am currently on the lands of the Oceti Sakowin, the 7 council fires of the Lakota, Nakota, and Dakota peoples, and where my wife and kids are enrolled on the Cheyenne River Sioux reservation. I myself are of Mexican descent. I come from the Purepecha, otherwise known as Tarascan, from the state of Michoacan. And the Raramuri people, the ones that run the very long distance races in the Chihuahua's Copper Canyon. I've been at this science game since about 1984, when I was a freshman undergraduate student at DePaul University. And I got my first job in a phycology lab, otherwise known as algae. And I went and got my bachelor's degree at Loyola Chicago. I was at the UW-Madison Veterinary School for quite a long time doing research, and then I moved over to the hospital and did research in transplant surgery and B-cell immunology. Then later on, I was a teacher at several tribal high schools. And after that, I joined a master's program at the UW Seattle and received a master's degree in pharmaceutics. I'm currently at Johns Hopkins finishing up a DRPH in public health. Myself and many of my colleagues from about 2010 had envisioned something like the Native Biodata Consortium, and we worked diligently, and we got our business license in South Dakota in 2018, our nonprofit status in 2019, and what makes us unique is that we are uniquely located inside the exterior boundaries of an American Indian nation. As I said, we are in South Dakota on the Cheyenne River Sioux Reservation, right in the middle, in the town of Eagle Butte. And as you can see from this diagram, South Dakota has 9 tribes, either Lakota or Dakota tribes. And the focus of my talk is the renewed because it never really went away, but the renewed interest in American Indian or Amerindigenous populations. In this paper published in 2008, it blithely gave reasons for targeting Mendelian families and isolated populations such as Polynesians, Native Americans, Australian Aborigines, and other such populations as a resource for scientific discovery and innovation. And if you read the abstract there, some people would find some of this language very disturbing in terms of its reductionism and essentialism and sort of focus on how these populations are going to help the rest of the world without mentioning anything about helping those people in their current suffering. We in the United States have gotten into this position starting from 1942, 41, when Publish or Perish became a mantra for academia. Um, if you don't know, science is basically a rich man's game because uh, in the past you weren't going to get rich as you weren't even really going to make a living as a scientist, so you had to be rich to start out as a scientist. But that has all changed with booming innovation and accelerated technology. And in 1980, there became a question, since most of our research was funded by public tax dollars, because research is expensive. And we were starting to get somewhere in terms of making things commercially applicable. Who owned the data from that research, since it was paid by all of us? A very communal act, which was something that was beautiful and has gotten twisted over time. So the Bayh-Dole Act basically says the United States, as the funder of this research, still owns it, but they license the rights to commercial ability to the universities or institutions where that funding had ended up. And what is sort of distressing about this is lots of scientists or researchers weren't aware of this, and that their intellectual property and their hard work was going to their universities and their university legal departments, which eventually culminated in the very protracted contest between the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and Jamie Thompson, the inventor of stem cell technology. They eventually settled those things, but when I was at the UW, it was common practice for researchers to get things close to commerciality and then take that data and that research off campus, so they themselves can capitalize on their own hard work rather than having the university do it. So these things continue to be a problem. And then Bayh-Dole was further entrenched with federal law HR 2272, which began with the George W. Bush administration in 2007 and was just re-ratified here in 2022. And it extended to lots of other federally funded data collection endeavors, basically, again, mandating that data be open and data be prioritized towards commercially applicable research so that the United States can compete on the world stage for innovation, science, and technology. However, both of these discussions or pieces of legislation really didn't consult with domestic dependent nations, which both Alaska Native corporations and American Indian Treaty Tribes are domestic dependent nations. And now we find ourselves in the era increasingly where tribal resources, whether it's timber, whether it's mineral rights, whether it's plants and animals, whether it's microbiology or human DNA, are becoming resources and an engine for capitalism in the United States. The Bill Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration have all put out this executive order saying that all federal departments have to consult with tribes on a nation-to-nation basis, because anything that was not ceded in specifically in treaty still belongs to tribes. And that includes all of these new resources that are able to be generated by new technology and scientific analysis. However, even though that did start with the Clinton administration, it can be argued and has been argued by me and my colleagues that consultation is done badly, poorly, not with enough focus on the long-term goals, benefits, or economic activity for tribes. And often consultation, because different departments don't have clear guidance from the White House or from Congress on what consultation means, ends up being notification and not consultation. And many tribal lawyers and many tribal academics believe consultation to be negotiation with a right of refusal. So this is the main thrust of this talk. So when we're talking about um, tribal sovereignty, other than the executive order, and executive orders are very subject to congressional or um, later presidents rescindment. It doesn't have the quite the force that it needs to have in order for it to be sustainable. So in addition to a congressional piece of legislation, something hard and fast, constitutional even, we need to have an Indigenous centered or focused ethics, because what we have right now is the common rule, which is based on the Belmont Report and the Nuremberg Report, which really didn't consider Indigenous people. In Europe, it was the Nazi Germans against the Jewish Germans, and other people in Europe. And also here in the United States, it was directed between white Americans and Black Americans with the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Indigenous ethics has lots of differences, not only cultural and spiritual, but basically primacy and sovereignty, and the right to say no within the bounds of tribal law. We need more policy law on both sides of the tribal border, inside the reservation and outside the reservation, and even across borders, because believe it or not, the United States has tribal populations with relatives that span the border into Canada and into Mexico, which brings me to my particular reason for making this video, which is right now Latin America is not really protected by any international law, and certainly not protected by the people who live there. If anybody's heard of the I'm forgetting it right now. There was a conference in 1955 called the Bamberg meeting, where they discussed that former colonies of Europe had to really struggle to totally break free from European colonization. And it was India, Africa, and Southeast Asia that were invited, but Latin America wasn't invited because Latin America was seen to be so corrupted by the Spanish caste system that they were hopelessly entrenched in sort of top to bottom infighting, where people who with indigenous ancestry and European ancestry often kick down at their indigenous relatives, and that continues today. There was a publication by Andres Moreno in conjunction with the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, where they sampled mestizos and indigenous people from Latin America for genetic associations with immune-related conditions. And now that all of that vital information that not only can serve to help people, but also serve to spur economies and revitalize and reclaim indigenous sovereignty, is now in the hands of a private company, Chan Zuckerberg. We need more international systems and support in terms of international legal systems, jurisdictional support, companies and policies that and universities that will push back against open data and change it to something more like accessed or managed data through decentralized and federated learning and sharing. Of course, we already know the military does this. Companies like Google do these things. They label and watermark their data so that it can be tracked through time and space, and indigenous people deserve the same deserve the same accommodation. And then the biggest thing is sustainability. Everybody else is moving very, very quickly through these new and innovative technologies, mostly because it's an unregulated space. There isn't a government on the planet that has been able to keep up with science and technology. And because they haven't, the people with the money can basically dive into that common pool of resources first, and tribes just don't have the money to compete. So tribes need some sort of sustainability of funding, or at least sustainability of rights over this data. So why now? Well, this actually started in the 90s and really got kickstarted after the mapping of the human genome in 2003, and has just been accelerating ever since. But it recently got a huge kick, unfortunately, from the SARS-CoV-2 epidemic, and otherwise known as COVID. And lots of countries suspended their regulation on different kinds of data. So in this country, we have, of course, clinical trials, FDA data, which was the vaccines. We have CDC, which is public health data, which you don't really have to consent people for. It's just sort of out there as a public service to the citizens of the United States. We have the NIH and to some degree the National Science Foundation, where data has to be consented, and then HIPAA regulations, which is all of your biomedical data, which is supposed to be private, mostly private from insurance companies. And then we have corporations that are entering into these public and private partnerships. And all of these barriers between the way that we collect data and protect data were dropped for the COVID epidemic, and in many ways have not been put up again. And lots of people crying to keep them down because it's worth a lot of money. They use the excuse that it's for the benefit, altruistic benefit, for curing disease, for having rapid innovation, spurring economies, all these great things. But it really is, in my opinion, a big risk to vulnerable and marginalized populations. To further my point, if you remember, when Africa was tagged with generating the new Omicron variant, and it scared a lot of people because it was highly contagious, that was because out of all the countries in the world, regions in the world, Africa was doing its best and surpassing lots of Western countries in terms of reporting and sequencing the changes in the virus. And because of that, they got tagged with originating the virus, and there was a ban on any travel to and from African countries. And then about 2 weeks later, we found out the origin was actually the UK, and there was no apology given. There was no remuneration for loss of travel or tourism or anything like that. And so since then, several African nations, including the H3 Africa nations, have really considered not sharing data with United States or Europe anymore. And this article discusses that. This Nature article basically says that these other world countries, I don't like to say first and third world countries, but other world countries do not want to be exploited by the West, not Canada, not Australia, not New Zealand, not Europe, and certainly not the United States. Here at the Native Biodata Consortium, we're very tuned not only into tribal and indigenous sovereignty, but the suffering of other marginalized and third world communities. So we ask all outsiders, especially those first line advocates, which is universities and academia, respect the suffering of tribal and indigenous people. Their economic suffering is continuing right now. Their political suffering is continuing right now. And definitely the environmental and racist environmental pollution that's happening in their territories, because they don't have the financial military or political wherewithal to keep it from happening, they're suffering. Respect the need for intervention, because if they do participate in research, they believe they're doing it because they're going to get help fairly soon, not some 50 years in the future. Respect the uniqueness of Indigenous people, their adaptation to place, and even in their admixture, that is vital information in terms of genomic architecture and genomic, generally omics relationships, all the way from coding to transcription to translation to protein function and eventually metabolism and disease conditions. All of these things are gold to pharmaceutical companies, to the military, to the medical industry. You have to respect it. Respect the proxy data. So now with the advent of machine learning and AI, data that's already out there, either as secondary use data from biomedicine or other demographic data and public health data sets, computers are very good at putting together something called a digital twin. This should not be happening without tribal input, and it should certainly not be a circumvention of tribal or indigenous authority, because as we all know, there are lots of data sitting on museum shelves all over the United States, in Europe, and other places that come from the Americas. And so what we're always afraid of is that they're going to get genetic sequences from the dead, and it's just not ethical, it's not moral, it's not restorative justice, it's not anything except exploitation. So in addition to tribal people here in the US and Canada, it's a human rights issue for many. We need more data discretion. And if it's not going to be legislated, then tribes have to take it upon themselves to do this. Data governance. Tribes need to create tribal codes and legislation and planning to govern their own data. Data translation. They can do this with external partners, but it would be better to build capacity and capability inside their home nation. Data implementation is the most severely lacking of the research process. Often when you get federal funding, people are very highly interested in the unique data from Indigenous people, but not at all interested in surpassing the many hurdles like the Indian Health Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Congress itself, that provides money and strategies and people to implement the data. That is not happening. And that's what needs to happen. If tribes had their own data, they can leverage their own vital opportunities to get funding and circumvent the federal and state governments and go to outside partners in other countries, with corporations, with other tribes if they have to. But if they had their own data, they can cut the middleman out, which is the federal government. And they themselves can decide on what's good for their tribe, their community, their environment, their children. All of this would happen under broad principles, policies, and legislation, otherwise known as the golden umbrella of an Indigenous data and sample sovereignty. So there has been progress since the 90s with a convention on biological diversity to create something called the Nagoya Protocol on access and benefit sharing to their own traditional knowledge, their own biological material and resources. However, early on in these international negotiations, they took human genetic material off the table because lawyers claimed that it was non-rivalrous and that it was non-controllable due to gene flow, which is not really the case in the Americas, I'm sorry to tell you. And I won't get into all of the legal language, but I believe that human DNA, especially because of proxy data and machine learning, human DNA needs to be put back into the Nagoya Protocol. The Nagoya Protocol has been attacked nonstop since its inception. by pharmaceutical companies claiming that the Nagoya Protocol, especially during COVID, was going to slow down discovery, which is, I can tell you from experience, is a lie. The Nagoya Protocol is not that powerful, number one, not as powerful as big lawyers and big pharma. Number two, they came up with these solutions without indigenous data. So these are false claims. Not only, but if you look at this list here, so the signatories since 2011, there's 139 parties, 140 ratifying countries, and 92 signatories. And these countries, the United Kingdom, Mexico, Ireland, and Australia, have signed. Only United Kingdom, Mexico, and Ireland have, at least from this list, have gone all the way to ratification and become a party to the Nagoya Protocol. Australia has not. But if you look, it's very interesting who didn't do anything. Canada, the United States, and New Zealand have not signed, not ratified, nor become a party to the Nagoya Protocol. Isn't that curious? I wonder why. So in terms of the United States federal policies, there's been tribal consultation policy modification since 2010. They're still kind of loosey-goosey, and one of the biggest problems with tribal consultation, if you read through it, gives authority to call something consultation or call a discussion or convening together all in the hands of the federal government. Tribes cannot call for a consultation. The All of Us research policy in 2021 made very tiny concessions, saying that they would not collect data from tribal lands and they would not collect tribal affiliation, but off reservation, they can pretty much do what they want. And because of something called a medical release form, once they get somebody's medical records, they will have their tribal affiliation in the medical records anyway. And to many of us, this is a breach of not only the spirit of the agreement, but a breach of tribal sovereignty. And believe me when I tell you that a lot of these genetic questions in terms of privacy, legal search and seizure, whether or not domestic dependent nations can have any rights to own their own genetic information is still a huge question and has not been addressed in court. So it's not just a risk for tribal people, it's a risk for all American citizens. And then we had a new data sharing policy of January 25th, 2023 with a durable addendum. It has caused lots of chaos and consternation, and the NIH is still wrangling with all of the implications from that data sharing policy, and we don't really know where it's going to land. The tribal addendum has some good things in it, but again, in terms of teeth and in terms of educating all federal departments on what that means or having them agree to what it means is still a matter of much debate. There was something good that came from the Office of Science and Technology policy, the Indigenous knowledge policy, which is probably the best out of all of these because it does recognize sort of the right of refusal and the originating input has to come from Indigenous people, but it's still not very strong. And the biggest problem with this policy is that it has Indigenous knowledge defined very narrowly, where most colleagues of mine and myself believe that any data, old or new, generated from tribal people, whether they generated themselves or it came from them extractively by somebody else, is still Indigenous knowledge. And that is not addressed in this policy. So basically, just like land back, we want data back. Very different from African American reparations. This is more about primacy of being here first, being here for 40,000 years, and undoing the very real violence and harm from the last 531 years. So where I am right now in the Yochetisha coin, they have a saying called Mitakuye Oyasi, which is we are all related, and it's a wonderful concept. It does not place man or woman at the top of any sort of biological or living hierarchy. Relatives can be alive or what some people call inanimate, like rocks and dirt. It's all our relatives. We are all related. We're all part of one big system, and humans are not the center. We're not at the top. We're just one a component in the system. But in terms of genetic research, none of us are in control. These are some ancient remains that have been found throughout Canada and the United States and Mexico. And lots of them had some pretty big fights. The most well-known is the ancient one, or Kennewick Man in Washington State. And the 5 tribes claimed that ancestor. It was a 15-year fight. Eventually, genetics came down in favor that he was indeed related to the local people. However, this fight continues with NAGPRA. NAGPRA has been on hold for about 7 years. They were supposed to shore it up and make it stronger, but there's been lots of calls for archaeologists and anthropologists to get rid of it or weaken it. So, but this is one of the things we have a fear of, is that the data from our people will be gathered through this loophole in the law. And then we also have the Human Genome Diversity Project, which is a project of Stanford and lots of other private organizations. The NIH at the time didn't want to have anything to do with it. They themselves, the NIH, thought it was unethical. And as you can see, there's a big gap in the United States. A few Canadian tribes were sampled, but since then that data has become privatized and is not generally available for use. But all of the rest is, again, as I said at the beginning, in Latin America, because tribes or indigenous people in Latin America have no rights. They have no sovereignty. It is a 17th century existence that they are living because of this concept of mestizaje and the concept of manifest destiny from the United States and the Monroe Doctrine of the United States. So the backyard of the United States, the honeypot, the treasure chest, whatever you want to call it, is Latin America for the United States. And this is not a good thing. And this is unfortunately what these genetic testing companies use as a reference, is the HTTP. And they, all of them, Ancestry, DNA, and 23andMe, this is one of their biggest selling items, is selling people the opportunity to find out if they're Native American or not. And it is worth big, big money. And guess what? Not only do people not know that most of the reference data is from Latin America, but the ones that are sort of paying the price, which is North American Indians, for they're paying the price for the profits for the ancestry companies, are not getting a dime. They were never consulted. Again, it's the Euro-colonial rules, Euro-colonial borders, and Euro-colonial reasons for trying to disempower and keep tribes divided, and having them now fight a new fight, which is they're trying to fight all of the people trying to come to their borders looking for benefits and resources, rather than going to the United States and looking for benefits and resources. They're going to poor tribes looking for those. So all of this is just getting worse. The lust for native data of any kind, not just genetic data, is continuing unabated and getting larger and exponential by the day. Um, we here at the NBDC are advocating for tribal data sovereignty over every kind of piece of data, no matter who pays for it. So normally there on the right, tribes might see their cultural data, historic data, enrollment data, legislative and regulatory data, and economic data as their own, but often they don't see the data that is collected on their behalf or by outside organization as theirs, but of course it is. It is like this in any nation, whether it's the United States, France, whomever, it's their data. The people inside the system are under the umbrella of the United States sovereignty, and the United States can pull their credentials, whether they're a doctor or lawyer or whatever, anytime they want to and get what they want. Tribes need to enact the same sort of attitude. So if you look at the far left column, all of this data is very important to tribes, but they don't necessarily claim it. Similarly, government data, especially licensing, passports, public health, environmental, wildlife data, that also should belong to the tribes, because it will help them not only do planning, but protect themselves from outsiders, from lawsuits and other kinds of things. Then, of course, we have what I'm talking about and have been talking about, like NIH data that's been collected under the Common Rule, and that has been sort of brokered at least since the 90s, with some tribal input, but mostly the decisions are made outside of tribal governments. And that data also belongs to them. And you see at the top here, the things that require consent, is uncomfortably common. And research, depending on the kind of research, sometimes needs consent, sometimes not. Same thing with tribal data. Sometimes consent is required, sometimes is not. And increasingly, environmental data, like LiDAR data, ground penetrating radar data, can look and have 20 to 30 layers of data, depending on the spectrum that they're looking at under the ground. So they could see minerals, they can see insects, microbes, prairie dogs, the stuff that grows on top, like trees and plants. They can get lots and lots of archaeological data, anthropological sites. So the technology is getting more and more powerful, and tribes aren't aware. So here at the Native Biodata Consortium, we do our best to enact something from Canada called OCAP, First Nations Principles, which is ownership, meaning the policies, pieces of legislation like resolutions, ordinance, statutes, and laws that will assert and maintain that ownership. Control, meaning tribal administrators, Native scientists, Native technicians, Native planners, and grant writers will control the data. Access, some tribal regulatory body made up of the ones I just spoke of would identify the people they would like to have the data to work with them. They would repatriate data that's out there. They would grant data sharing permissions and rules to outsiders. So basically controlling all the access, getting access to data off reservation, and once it's in their hands, allowing or permitting other people to use it or see it. And then possession, which is what the NBDC does, is we are on tribal lands under tribal jurisdiction. It is here, it is nowhere else, and it's not going anywhere. So here at the Native Biodata Consortium, we wanted to keep samples and data local, just like I said. We want to build tribal capacity and capability. So capacity and capability are slightly different. Capacity means you have everything you need. And even if you have training, that's capacity. Capability is different. Capability means whether or not the environment is suitable for you to enact or assert your power over doing something. And I'll get to that example in a moment. Foster trust in research. Lots of tribal citizens and tribal governments don't trust research, but research is needed. So it's not being done because there isn't any trust. So hopefully if we do it with tribal people on tribal lands, people will trust it. And then doing research that benefits tribes. Like I said, instead of 50 years in the future, there's lots of things that can be done this year and within 5 years, and it's not being done because there's no money for implementation and there's no trust to get it done. So we are using the limited authority of domestic dependent nations to harness this power to do this work. We all need a safe harbor. The West is a bully. It doesn't matter if it's Canada, Europe, Australia, or the United States, they're a bully. And there's lots of countries that need a safe harbor. They need to collect this data and they need the time to make these decisions, enact these pieces of legislation, build up the training in their communities and get this work done. But they can't do it if Western countries are grabbing up all the data as fast as they can. So the NBDC wants to be that safe harbor. We want to protect and build. We want to collect and repatriate data and samples and merge and appropriately use tribal data sets in a harmonized and sensible manner. Like I said, proxy data is very good at talking about humans. So it's our environmental, demographic, archaeological. What tribes don't have is longitudinal data. They have lots of cross-sectional data, and often they don't have access to it. So we want to start collecting longitudinal data or create artificial longitudinal data as much as we can by putting data sets together. We don't want to monetize it. That's up to the tribe if they want to monetize it. All we want to do is give the tribes the ability to answer questions for themselves, plan, protect themselves from lawsuit, enact lawsuits, and lots of things that they can do with data that's not necessarily commercial. And like I said, air, water, soil, wildlife, agriculture will be included because it's necessary. Well, often tribes lack our experts. We are trying to build a network of experts, not only here, but in the Pacific Islands, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Alaska, Mexico, Greenland, anywhere where there's Indigenous people. We are building up a network of experts. And in this screen, you see myself, Crystal Sosi, who's Navajo, Kalu Fox, who is Kanaka Maoli. They're both geneticists. And then Guthrie Ducheneau, here from Cheyenne River, who is a businessman and a computer specialist and computer contractor. Funding. So some of you might wonder how we got our funding. We did something wonderful. We partnered sort of private organization, the Snyder Lab, who started off at Yale, moved to Stanford, and him and his postdoc, Jennifer Lee Puptan, really got us off to the races, starting with a study on rheumatoid arthritis in the Lakota. And they have been partners with us ever since 2009. And they really got things going very well and allowed us to do lots of very free things, free thinking, free moving, free acting things, which is why I'm here able to say these things and challenge the NIH like I'm doing in this video. They were instrumental at helping us find funding to start the NBDC and maintain the NBDC. So we're very thankful to them. And then one of the things that we were part of is the Stanford Position Health for Ethnic and Racial Equity, which was led by Mark Cullen and Yvonne Maldonado. Yvonne Maldonado is still one of our supporters and strongest partners, and we love her for her help. Another thing that tribes need are infrastructure. We have been building a lab with state-of-the-art equipment. We are one of the few, if not only, tribal institutes to have a genetic sequencer from alumina, which is a feather in our cap, and we're very grateful to have, and we're still building around that piece of equipment to have more power and capacity to do this work. Causes. We need a cause. Everybody needs a cause. I think it's very apparent from what I was talking about that we have a cause. But just to hit it home, Stephanie Carroll, Desi Rodriguez Lombear, lots of people in the data sovereignty movement have educated us and helped us with our cause. And the cause is that tribes have been too reliant on data from outside, federal government data, different bureaucratic and institutional data, and not control of that data for analysis, use, or implementation. So we want to be in this cycle of data rebuilding and nation rebuilding and separation from the federal government in order to have true sustainability, self-governance, self-determination, and to take back and reclaim, revitalize Indigenous culture, land, and primacy in the Americas. Community's been difficult. This is very heady stuff, even for PhDs to go through. There's so many moving parts. Data sovereignty is not easy. Doing science is not easy. Finding the money to do these things is not easy. So just to remind you, we are trying to get a picture of reality from our data. And more often than not, tribes suffer because their data makes the inaccurate model that you see on the right, and it limits their ability to move forward. And I think that most community members don't understand how inaccurate their data is, and how much that data informs racism, stereotypes, lack of caring or lack of motivation to change, lack of will. So we need better data. Communities often have to satisfy other of Maslow's hierarchy, like food, employment, housing. Some tribes are not always okay with the IRA governments. They want a traditional government, and it's a source of tension, another limitation to getting things moving forward. Some believe in sovereignty and they think it should grow. Other ones think it's a losing proposition and they should assimilate and become American citizens. There's also a romanticization of a past too much without looking to the future and how the past can inform the future and create a new tribal nation based on the past, but with the tools from the future. Some people are just holding tight, they're just gripping that steering wheel, hoping they don't crash. And other people are a lot more relaxed and saying, we can do this. We have the ability, we have the knowledge, we have the confidence in our creator to move forward. And then others don't understand what data is and how powerful it is now. It's the world's top currency, data. And these disputes from the West, imposed by the West, individual versus communal rights, ends up being part of this wet versus dry conundrum. So wet data, meaning biological fluids or tissues, is under control of the individual and very centered on individual rights, where dry data is under the authority of the government because it's communally held. Here at the NBDC, we don't make a distinction because it's hard to collect samples, and samples are valuable. You don't get dry data until you have wet data, and it's expensive. So any wet data you collect, by definition, will turn into dry data, because nobody's going to go collect new samples if there's samples in a freezer somewhere. And that's what has happened outside of tribal jurisdiction. They're called legacy samples. So when certain researchers tell tribal citizens that they should go against their tribal government because they have the individual rights to participate in research, that they have control of their samples, it's sort of a hypocritical assertion, because once off reservation lands, those same researchers use legacy samples that were in the freezer and don't have a chain of custody or a pathway of control from the tribe. And that's wrong, because they're not talking about individual rights at that point when it's out of tribal hands. So we think that wet and dry data, the line is blurred. It's been blurred for a while. So again, just like with driver's licenses, passports, foster care, whatever, the tribal umbrella of sovereignty applies. So inside that umbrella, sure, people can participate or not participate. They can pull their sample or not pull their sample, but it is not for outsiders to decide, use, capitalize, commercialize, none of that. So I said a few slides back that I was going to talk about capacity and capabilities. So a lot of these things are high end and very expensive to do. And it would be similar, metaphorically, to somebody giving a 5-year-old a Lamborghini or a race car of some kind here in a tribal environment where there's lots of gravel roads, or there's no roads at all, or it's all muddy. Great to have a Lamborghini or a race car, but you can't use it. So capacity's there. You have the race car's capacity, but you don't have the capability. And that's what I was talking about. And oftentimes, at least in my view, that conundrum of capacity versus capability ends up being sort of a manipulatory tactic to say, hey, you can't use it, but we built it. Can we use it? And then it becomes, can we have it? And that's wrong. And so that's resulted in this sort of ethics of destruction. After the Havasupai case, where the Havasupai were taken advantage by Arizona State University on their samples, they were used outside tribal authority and discretion, which they settled out of court, both parties. There has been this push towards destroying samples and data, which, if it was in the hands of people you don't trust, or might harm you with it, or might exploit it, yes, that makes sense. But if you have a place inside tribal jurisdiction protected by tribal law and tribal researchers, destruction is not ethical. If somebody gave you a Lamborghini that you can drive and was built for you, and then said, destroy it, you'd say, no, I'm still using it. Why would I destroy it? So there's a little bit of a misunderstanding in terms of the ethics of destruction. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't destroy things that were built for us. What we should do is find a way to get them under our control so that we can be like every other nation and use them longitudinally, like they're supposed to be. The fight for no DAPL at Standing Rock, that suffered because they didn't have longitudinal data. You have to have data before and after COVID to see how things changed, how people changed, whether or not long COVID's a real thing, whether or not your water was clean in the past compared to now after the KXL pipeline. So data and samples should not be destroyed if they're in tribal control and protected. So I hope I made myself clear with that. So this slide is from my colleague, Dr. Crystal Sosi at Arizona State University, again, a tribal member of the Dene Nation, otherwise known as Navajo. And we think we can do this. All tribes can do this. You can use traditional knowledge labels, and there's lots of examples of them, um, and biocultural labels. And this is done by our friends, Local Context, which is a consortium of Indigenous people from around the world, centered at New York University. Watermarking data, like I said earlier, that Google and other companies do to track data through space and time. Building portals that not only track consent of participants, but also consent of tribes, making institutional memory digitized so we don't ever forget. We can never be swindled because it's all there, stored forever in some digital system, and everybody gets to see it. It's transparent. Nothing's forgotten, nothing's confusing, nothing's obfuscated. And then we have blockchain and ledger systems, which gives individuals more control over how their data is used and when it's used and who it's used by. Then we have decentralized and federated learning. We don't need the cloud. We can do these things without the cloud. We can keep the data here and still share data. And then Dockerizing, containerizing makes that sharing of data across space and time secure. That it's limited, it's revocable, it's trackable, and very controllable. So we can do this, people. So we thank you for your attention. Again, I'm Joseph Ursheta, the Executive Director of the Native Biodata Consortium, and you can find us at www.nativebio.org. We also have a YouTube channel. Just look up Native Biodata and it will pop up for you. Thank you very much.